Margaret Hensley was the kind of woman everyone in her small town admired. At 72 years old, she carried herself with a quiet grace that made people feel at ease. Her silver hair was always neatly combed, and her warm smile could light up even the gloomiest day. Margaret lived alone in a cozy little house surrounded by a garden bursting with colorful flowers and vegetables. She had spent decades raising her son, Michael, as a single mother, after losing her husband early in life. Though Michael had grown up and moved away to pursue his career, Margaret never felt truly lonely. Her days were filled with purpose, baking pies for neighbors, volunteering at the local church, and tending to her beloved plants. Every morning, Margaret would wake up before sunrise, brew herself a cup of tea, and sit by the window to watch the world come alive. Birds chirped outside, and the soft breeze carried the scent of blooming roses into her living room. It was a peaceful existence, far removed from the chaos of big cities. Margaret loved her routine. She cherished the simplicity of her life, finding joy in the little things: a handwritten note from an old friend, the laughter of children playing down the street, or the satisfaction of pulling weeds from her garden. But beneath this idyllic surface, shadows loomed in the town. Unbeknownst to Margaret, a group of corrupt police officers had been operating in plain sight, exploiting the most vulnerable members of the community. These men wore badges, but their actions were anything but honorable. They preyed on elderly residents like Margaret, accusing them of crimes they hadn't committed so they could seize their homes and sell them off for profit. To the outside world, these officers appeared professional and trustworthy. But behind closed doors, they were orchestrating a sinister scheme. Margaret had no reason to suspect trouble. She paid her taxes, followed the rules, and kept to herself. Her only interaction with law enforcement came when she occasionally waved hello to passing patrol cars during her evening walks. The thought of being targeted by such corruption never crossed her mind. After all, why would anyone want to harm someone like her? She wasn't rich, her home wasn't particularly valuable. She was just an ordinary woman trying to live out her golden years in peace. One fateful evening, as Margaret returned from the grocery store with a bag of fresh produce, she noticed something unusual. A police car was parked near the end of her driveway, its lights flashing silently in the dusk. 2 officers stood beside it, scanning the area. When Margaret approached, one of them stepped forward with a polite smile. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "we've received reports of suspicious activity around here. Would you mind if we took a quick look inside your house?" At first, Margaret hesitated. Something about the situation felt off, though. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. But then she reminded herself that these were police officers, people sworn to protect and serve. Surely they wouldn't ask to search her home unless it was necessary. With a nod, she unlocked her front door and invited them in. Little did she know this simple act of trust would set off a chain of events that would turn her quiet life upside down. As the officers wandered through her house, asking casual questions about her daily routine, Margaret began to feel uneasy. Their presence disrupted the calm she had worked so hard to maintain. Still, she tried to stay composed, answering their queries politely while wondering what exactly they were looking for. What she didn't realize was that they weren't searching for evidence. They were planting it. And once they found what they had hidden, Margaret's world would change forever. The 2 officers moved through Margaret's home with an air of practiced casualness, their boots clicking against the wooden floors. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and a clipboard in hand, asked her questions about her daily routine, where she went shopping, whether she had visitors often, how long she'd lived in the house. His tone was friendly, almost conversational, but there was something unsettling about the way his eyes darted around the room. The second officer, shorter and bulkier, lingered near the kitchen, inspecting cabinets and shelves with exaggerated care. Margaret hovered nearby, clutching her grocery bag tightly as if it might somehow shield her from the growing unease in her chest. She tried to remind herself that these men were here to help, to ensure her safety. But as the minutes ticked by, their behavior became increasingly strange. They opened drawers she hadn't touched in years, peered under furniture, and even checked the contents of her spice rack. "Is everything all right?" she finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You said this was just a routine check." The taller officer flashed her another smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything's fine, ma'am," he assured her. "We're just being thorough." Meanwhile, the shorter officer busied himself in the kitchen. He crouched down to examine the lower cabinets, his back turned to Margaret. From where she stood, she couldn't see what he was doing, but she noticed the subtle shift in his posture, a quick glance over his shoulder, a flicker of hesitation before he straightened up. When he turned to face her again, he held a small, plastic bag filled with white powder. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly stern, "do you know what this is?" Margaret froze, her heart pounding in her chest. What are you talking about?" she stammered, taking a step closer. Her mind raced as she stared at the bag in his hand. It looked foreign, out of place among her neatly arranged pots and pans. She had never seen it before in her life. "This appears to be cocaine," the officer announced, his tone clipped and official now. He held up the bag for the other officer to see, who nodded gravely. "It was found in your cabinet, ma'am. I'm afraid we'll need to take you in for questioning." For a moment, Margaret couldn't breathe. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Cocaine? In her kitchen? It was impossible. She didn't even know anyone who used drugs, let alone kept them in her home. "This isn't mine," she protested, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know how that got there. You must have put it there." The taller officer sighed, shaking his head as if he'd heard this excuse 100 times before. "Ma'am, please don't make this harder on yourself. If you cooperate, things will go much smoother for you." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. These men, the ones she had trusted to protect her, were accusing her of something she hadn't done, and worse, they seemed completely convinced of her guilt. No matter how loudly she denied it, no one was listening. As the officers led her out of the house, handcuffs clicking into place around her frail wrists, Margaret felt the weight of shame and fear pressing down on her. Neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering behind cupped hands as they watched the scene unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others wore expressions of disbelief or judgment. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the ground, unable to meet their eyes. How could this be happening? She had lived in this town for decades, known these people her entire life. Yet now she was being treated like a criminal. The ride to the police station was silent except for the hum of the car engine. Margaret sat in the back seat, her hands trembling in her lap. Her mind raced with questions. Why would they do this to her? What did they hope to gain? And most importantly, how could she prove her innocence when all the evidence pointed to her guilt? When they arrived at the station, Margaret was ushered into a cold, sterile room and told to wait. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the walls. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt truly alone. There was no one here to defend her, no one to believe her side of the story. As she sat there staring at the blank wall in front of her, a single thought echoed in her mind. I need my son. The hours dragged on as Margaret sat in the cold, sterile room at the police station. Her wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, and her mind raced with fear and confusion. She had never been in trouble with the law before, never even received so much as a parking ticket, and yet here she was accused of possessing illegal drugs. The absurdity of it all made her want to scream, but she knew that wouldn't help. Instead, she tried to stay calm, focusing on one thing: getting out of this nightmare. Eventually, an officer returned to the room and informed her that she would be formally charged with possession of narcotics. Margaret's heart sank as he explained the potential consequences: fines, jail time, and possibly losing her home due to asset forfeiture laws. This is insane, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. You have to believe me. I didn't do this. Someone planted those drugs in my house. The officer merely shrugged, his expression indifferent. That's not for me to decide, ma'am. You'll have your chance to explain everything in court. With that, he left the room, leaving Margaret alone once again. Later that evening, a public defender arrived to speak with her. He was a young man with tired eyes and a stack of files tucked under his arm. After briefly reviewing her case, he told her bluntly that fighting the charges would be difficult without solid evidence proving her innocence. "Look, Mrs. Hensley," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I get that you're scared, and I understand why you're saying this isn't yours. But the truth is, juries don't always buy that kind of defense. If I were you, I'd consider taking a plea deal." "A plea deal?" Margaret repeated, stunned. "But I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I admit to something I didn't do?" The lawyer sighed, clearly uninterested in arguing. "Because it's easier than going to trial. Trust me, people take deals like this all the time. It'll save you a lot of hassle and probably some money too." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, I won't lie and say I'm guilty when I'm not. I need someone who believes me, who will fight for me." The lawyer gave her a pitying look before gathering his things and leaving. As the door closed behind him, Margaret felt a wave of despair wash over her. Was everyone against her? Did no one care about the truth? That night, curled up on a hard bench in the holding cell, Margaret realized she couldn't rely on anyone in this town. Not the officers, not the lawyers, and certainly not the system that seemed determined to crush her. She needed someone stronger, smarter, and more relentless. Someone who wouldn't give up until justice was served. Her thoughts turned to Michael, her son. Though they hadn't spoken much lately, she knew deep down that he was her only hope. Michael wasn't just any lawyer. He was sharp, resourceful, and fiercely protective of those he loved. Growing up, he had always stood by her side, defending her from bullies and solving problems with a level head. Now more than ever, she needed him. Summoning what little courage she had left, Margaret requested access to a phone. When the guard finally brought her to a payphone in the hallway, her hands trembled as she dialed Michael's number. Each ring felt like an eternity, and for a moment she feared he wouldn't answer. But then his familiar voice came through the line. "Mom, is everything okay?" Michael asked, concern evident in his tone. Margaret broke down, sobbing as she tried to explain what had happened. Through her tears, she told him about the officers, the drugs, the arrest, and the disbelief she faced at every turn. "Michael, I didn't do this," she pleaded. "I swear on your father's grave I'm innocent. Please, you have to help me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, Michael spoke, his voice firm and resolute. "Don't worry, Mom. I'm coming home. We'll figure this out together." For the first time since her arrest, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Michael was coming. Whatever it took, he would uncover the truth and clear her name. As she hung up the phone and returned to her cell, she clung to that thought, repeating it like a mantra in her mind. He's coming. He'll make this right. Michael. Hensley's life in Chicago was a whirlwind of deadlines, court appearances, and late-night strategy sessions. As a high-powered attorney known for his sharp mind and unrelenting work ethic, he had built a reputation as someone who could tackle the toughest cases. But despite his success, his relationship with his mother, Margaret, had grown distant over the years. Work consumed most of his time, leaving little room for personal connections. So when his phone rang late that night, and he heard his mother's panicked voice on the other end, it felt like the ground beneath him shifted. "Mom, slow down," Michael said, gripping the phone tightly as he tried to make sense of her frantic explanation. The words arrested, drugs, and corrupt cops stood out sharply against the background noise of her sobs. His chest tightened as the gravity of the situation sank in. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. It was a full-blown attack on the woman who had raised him, the person he loved most in the world. And if what she was saying was true, then the people responsible weren't just careless, they were malicious. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Michael promised, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Hanging up the phone, he immediately began making arrangements. He canceled meetings, postponed cases, and booked the first flight back to his hometown. As he packed a suitcase with hurried efficiency, memories of his childhood flooded his mind. His mother teaching him how to bake cookies, sitting by her side during church services, watching her tend to their garden with unwavering patience. She had sacrificed so much for him, and now it was his turn to protect her. When Michael arrived at the police station the next morning, he was met with a scene that made his blood boil. Margaret looked smaller than he remembered, her usually vibrant spirit dimmed by exhaustion and fear. Her hands trembled as she reached out to hug him, and her eyes were red from crying. Seeing her like this ignited something primal in Michael, a fierce determination to fight for her no matter the cost. After securing her release on bail, Michael wasted no time diving into the case. He requested copies of all documents related to her arrest, including the police report and evidence logs. What he found only deepened his suspicions. The report was riddled with inconsistencies. The timeline didn't add up, key details were missing, and there was no mention of any witnesses or credible leads linking Margaret to the drugs. It was sloppy work, almost as if the officers hadn't bothered to cover their tracks properly because they assumed no one would question them. But Michael wasn't just anyone. He had spent years honing his ability to spot loopholes and uncover hidden truths, and he wasn't about to let this slide. The first thing he did was hire a private investigator named Claire Dawson, a seasoned professional with a knack for digging up dirt. Together, they began piecing together a profile of the officers involved in Margaret's arrest. Claire started by reviewing past cases handled by the same detectives, looking for patterns of misconduct. Meanwhile, Michael scoured local news, archives, and community forums for stories of similar incidents. It didn't take long for a disturbing picture to emerge. Over the past few years, several elderly residents in the area had been arrested under suspicious circumstances, often accused of crimes involving drugs or stolen property. Many had lost their homes due to asset forfeiture laws, only to see those properties sold off quickly to anonymous buyers. Some victims had tried to speak out, but their voices were drowned out by the weight of authority. No one believed them. Not the courts, not the media, and certainly not the police department itself. As Michael reviewed the mounting evidence, his anger grew. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated scheme designed to exploit the vulnerable. And his mother had become their latest target. But Michael wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. Sitting across from Margaret later that evening, Michael laid out his plan. "We're going to expose them, Mom," he said, firmly. "Every lie, every dirty trick, they're all going to come to light. But we need to move carefully. If we make one wrong move, they'll try to bury us." Margaret nodded, though her expression remained wary. "Do you really think we can win against them? They're powerful, Michael. They've got badges, titles, connection." "They might have power," Michael interrupted, his voice filled with conviction. "But we've got the truth. And I promise you, Mom, we won't stop until everyone knows exactly what they've done." For the first time since her arrest, Margaret allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Her son was here, and he wasn't backing down. Whatever came next, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The days that followed were a blur of activity for Michael and Margaret as they worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the corrupt officer's scheme. Michael's office transformed into a makeshift command center with stacks of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes covering every available surface. Claire, the private investigator, sent regular updates via email and text, each one bringing more pieces of the puzzle into focus. Together, they began connecting the dots between Margaret's case and the string of suspicious arrests that had plagued the town over the years. One evening, after hours of poring over files, Michael found something that made his heart race. A pattern in property sales linked to homes seized through asset forfeiture. The properties were being sold at below-market prices to shell companies with vague names like Sunrise Holdings LLC or Pinecrest Investments. Digging deeper, he discovered that these companies shared addresses and directors tied to real estate firms owned by relatives of the officers involved. It was clear. The corruption wasn't just about framing innocent people, it was also about profit. Armed with this new information, Michael decided it was time to confront the lead detective on Margaret's case. He arranged a meeting under the pretense of discussing potential plea deals, hoping to catch the man off guard. When Michael walked into the precinct conference room, Detective Harris, an imposing figure with a gruff demeanor, was already seated at the table, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Mr. Hensley," Harris said, leaning back in his chair, I assume you're here to talk about your mother's situation? Michael nodded but didn't sit down. Instead, he placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Harris. Inside were copies of property records, bank statements, and internal police memos detailing questionable practices. Take a look, Michael said, his voice calm but firm. This is just a fraction of what I've uncovered so far. Harris glanced at the documents, his face unreadable. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. You think throwing around papers is going to scare me? These are baseless accusations, counselor. My team followed protocol, plain and simple. That's where you're wrong, Michael shot back, his tone sharpening. Your protocol involves planting evidence, stealing homes, and lining your pockets while destroying lives. But don't worry, I'm not planning to stop until everyone knows exactly who you really are. For a brief moment, Harris's confident facade cracked. His jaw tightened and his eyes darted toward the closed door as if weighing his options. But then he forced a smirk, leaning forward slightly. Listen, kid. You can dig all you want, but no one's going to believe some big city lawyer over decorated officers like us. We've got badges, credibility, you've got nothing. Michael met his gaze without flinching. We'll see about that. Back at his temporary workspace, Michael realized that exposing the corruption wouldn't be enough on its own. He needed public support to pressure the authorities into taking action. That's when he reached out to an old friend from law school, Sarah Bennett, now a respected investigative journalist based in Chicago. Over a secure video call, Michael explained everything, from the planted drugs to the fraudulent property sales, and shared the evidence his team had gathered. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing darker with each revelation. This is huge, she said finally. If we play our cards right, this could blow the lid off the entire department. Are you ready for what comes next? I have to be, Michael replied. My mom's counting on me. Within days, Sarah published an explosive exposé detailing the corruption within the police force. The article included damning evidence, victim testimonials, and expert analysis, painting a vivid picture of systemic abuse. The story spread like wildfire, dominating local news outlets and sparking outrage across the community. Protesters gathered outside the police station holding signs that read, "Justice for the vulnerable," and "Corruption has no place in our town." Calls poured in demanding accountability, forcing city officials to take notice. As the scandal gained traction, Internal Affairs launched an investigation into the officers implicated in the scheme. Search warrants were issued, computers were seized, and interviews were conducted. One by one, the walls protecting the corrupt cops began to crumble. For Margaret, watching the tide turn from her living room was surreal. She felt a mix of relief and disbelief, as though she were waking up from a nightmare she never thought would end. But Michael knew the fight wasn't over yet. While the system slowly ground toward justice, he stayed by his mother's side, determined to ensure that no stone was left unturned. Together, they had taken the first step toward reclaiming their lives and holding the guilty accountable. The investigation into the corrupt officers quickly gained momentum, fueled by the mounting public pressure and the undeniable evidence Michael and his team had uncovered. Internal Affairs worked around the clock, interviewing witnesses, reviewing surveillance footage, and combing through financial records. It wasn't long before cracks began to show in the carefully constructed facade the officers had maintained for years. Detective Harris, once so confident in his invincibility, found himself at the center of the storm. His home was raided early one morning, with agents seizing computers, phones, and boxes of documents. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as he was led out in handcuffs, his face pale and expressionless. Two other officers implicated in the scheme met similar fates, their arrests broadcasted on local news channels. For Margaret, seeing these men who had treated her with such cold disdain, finally face consequences was both satisfying and surreal. Justice, though slow, was beginning to take shape. Meanwhile, the public outcry grew louder. Town hall meetings were packed with angry residents demanding answers. Some shared stories of how they or their loved ones had been targeted by the same group of officers. An elderly man named Walter recounted how he'd lost his family home after being falsely accused of theft. a young woman tearfully described how her grandmother had died of stress while fighting similar charges. Each story added fuel to the fire, further exposing the depth of the corruption that had infected the department. As the scandal unfolded, Michael became a central figure in the fight for accountability. Reporters camped outside his mother's house, eager to hear his thoughts on the case. He spoke passionately about the need for systemic reform, emphasizing that this wasn't just about punishing a few bad apples. It was about ensuring such abuses of power could never happen again. "This isn't just my mother's story," he told a reporter during one interview. "It's a wake-up call for all of us. We can't allow fear and complacency to let injustice thrive." Margaret, too, found her voice amidst the chaos. Encouraged by Michael, she agreed to speak publicly about her experience, hoping it might inspire others to come forward. At first, she was hesitant, worried about drawing more attention to herself. But when she stood before a crowd of supporters at a community rally, clutching Michael's hand for support, she felt an unexpected surge of courage. "I'm not special," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath. "I'm just an ordinary person who trusted the people sworn to protect me. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, not in this town, not anywhere." Her words resonated deeply with those in attendance, many of whom wiped away tears as she spoke. By sharing her story, Margaret transformed from a victim into a symbol of resilience. People started referring to her as the woman who took down corruption, and while she humbly deflected the praise, there was no denying the impact she and Michael had made. Behind the scenes, Michael continued strategizing with Sarah, the journalist, and Claire, the private investigator, to ensure every piece of evidence was properly documented and presented. They filed lawsuits against the officers individually and collectively, seeking damages for the harm caused to victims like Margaret. The legal battle promised to be lengthy and complex, but Michael was prepared to see it through. "We're not stopping until we've dismantled this entire operation," he told Margaret one evening as they reviewed court filings together. "They thought they were untouchable, Mom, but now the whole world knows the truth." For Margaret, the turning point came when the district attorney officially dropped all charges against her. Standing beside Michael in a packed courtroom, she listened as the judge declared her innocence, clearing her name once and for all. Cheers erupted from the gallery, where friends, neighbors, and even strangers had gathered to show their support. As Margaret hugged Michael tightly, tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "Thank you for believing in me." Though the road ahead would still require vigilance and perseverance, Margaret and Michael knew they had achieved something remarkable. Together, they had exposed a dark chapter in their town's history and ignited a movement for change. The corrupt officers were behind bars, their schemes dismantled, and the community was united in its demand for justice. For Margaret, the ordeal had tested her strength in ways she never imagined, but it had also reminded her of the power of love, determination, and standing up for what's right. The aftermath of the scandal brought both relief and reflection to Margaret's small town. The three officers at the heart of the corruption, Detective Harris and his accomplices, were formally charged with multiple counts of misconduct, conspiracy, and theft. Their trial became a media sensation, drawing attention not just locally but nationwide. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, bank statements showing suspicious deposits, property records linking seized homes to shell companies, and testimonies from victims whose lives had been shattered by the scheme. It was impossible for the defense to deny the mountain of proof stacked against them. As the verdict was read aloud in court, guilty on all charges, a wave of cheers erupted from the gallery. Margaret sat quietly beside Michael, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't cheer or celebrate. Instead, she felt a profound sense of closure. For months, these men had controlled her life, turning it upside down with lies and cruelty. Now, justice had finally caught up with them. But as she looked around the courtroom, filled with reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens, she realized that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had suffered because of their actions. In the weeks that followed, reforms began sweeping through the police department. New leadership was appointed, investigative protocols were overhauled, and stricter oversight measures were implemented to prevent future abuses. Community members demanded transparency, organizing forums where residents could voice concerns directly to law enforcement officials. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild, though Margaret knew it would take time for wounds this deep to fully heal. For Margaret personally, life started returning to some semblance of normalcy. Her home, which had been flagged for asset forfeiture during her arrest, was officially returned to her without conditions. Neighbors stopped by more often now, bringing casseroles and flowers as gestures of support. Some even apologized for doubting her innocence when the ordeal first unfolded. "I never thought something like this could happen here," one woman admitted during a visit. "You've shown us how important it is to stand up for what's right." But Margaret didn't want to dwell on bitterness or resentment. Instead, she focused on rebuilding, not just her own life, but also the fractured connections within her community. Inspired by the outpouring of solidarity during the scandal, she decided to turn her experience into something positive. With Michael's encouragement, she founded a non-profit organization aimed at helping victims of systemic injustice navigate the legal system and reclaim their lives. They named it Voices Unsilenced, a tribute to the courage it took for people like Margaret to speak out despite fear and doubt. Michael, too, underwent a transformation. His work on his mother's case reignited a passion for advocacy he hadn't felt since his early days as a lawyer, though he still maintained his practice. In Chicago, he dedicated part of his time to pro bono cases involving police misconduct and wrongful convictions. He partnered with Sarah, the journalist, to create educational workshops for communities on recognizing signs of corruption and holding authorities accountable. Together, they traveled across the state, sharing Margaret's story as a powerful reminder of resilience and hope. Margaret and Michael's bond grew stronger than ever during this period. Years of distance melted away as they worked side by side, united by a shared purpose. Evenings were spent brainstorming ideas for Voices Unsilenced, drafting letters to policymakers and planning fundraisers. Margaret marveled at how much her son had grown, not just professionally but emotionally. "You've always been my protector," she told him one night as they sat together on her porch, watching the sunset. "But now I see you protecting others too. Your father would be so proud." Though the scars of the past remained, Margaret chose to focus on the lessons she had learned. She had discovered an inner strength she didn't know she possessed, forged through adversity and fueled by love for her family and community. And while she couldn't undo the pain she'd endured, she could use her experience to light the way for others facing similar struggles. One evening, as she watered her garden, a space that had once symbolized peace before becoming collateral damage in her fight for justice, Margaret paused to admire the vibrant blooms. Life, like her flowers, had a way of bouncing back after storms. The road ahead might still hold challenges, but she faced it with renewed optimism. After all, she reminded herself, sometimes the darkest nights give rise to the brightest dawns. As the months passed, Margaret's life began to take on a new rhythm, one marked by purpose, connection, and quiet triumphs. Her nonprofit organization, Voices Unsilenced, quickly gained traction, drawing support from across the country. People were inspired by her story and eager to contribute to the cause. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and soon Margaret found herself leading workshops, hosting community events, and mentoring individuals who had been wronged by systems meant to protect them. What started as a small idea born out of hardship blossomed into a movement that empowered countless others to reclaim their voices. Michael played an integral role in the organization's success. His legal expertise proved invaluable as he helped draft petitions, file lawsuits, and advocate for policy changes at both local and national levels. Together, mother and son became a formidable team, combining compassion with determination to create real change. Their partnership was more than just professional. It was deeply personal, rooted in mutual respect and love. Margaret often joked that Michael had inherited his father's stubbornness but channeled it toward good causes. while Michael credited his mother's resilience for teaching him what true strength looked like. The ripple effects of their work extended far beyond their town. The exposé written by Sarah sparked conversations about police accountability nationwide, prompting lawmakers to introduce legislation aimed at preventing similar abuses of power. Cities began reviewing their asset forfeiture laws, ensuring they couldn't be exploited by corrupt officials. Activists cited Margaret's case as a turning point, a moment when ordinary people stood up against injustice and won. For Margaret, knowing her struggle had ignited such widespread reform was humbling. "I never set out to be anyone's hero," she told a reporter during an interview. "I just wanted my life back. But if sharing my story helps someone else fight for theirs, then maybe all of this pain wasn't for nothing." Life at home also underwent subtle yet meaningful changes. Margaret's garden, once neglected during her darkest days, flourished under her renewed care. She planted new flowers, bright marigolds and resilient daisies, as symbols of hope and perseverance. Neighbors often stopped by to chat or lend a hand, their visits filled with laughter and shared meals. Margaret cherished these moments, realizing how much she had missed being part of a close-knit community. Even Michael made it a point to visit more frequently, balancing his demanding career with quality time spent reconnecting with his mother. One sunny afternoon, Margaret hosted a small gathering in her backyard to celebrate the one-year anniversary of Voices Unsilenced. Friends, volunteers, and supporters gathered around picnic tables laden with homemade pies and lemonade. As Margaret stood to address the crowd, her voice wavered slightly, not from fear, but from gratitude. "A year ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here today," she began, pausing to smile at Michael, who stood nearby. "I was scared, alone, and convinced no one would believe me. But because of you, all of you, I found the courage to keep fighting. And now, we're helping others do the same." Her words brought tears to many eyes, including Michael's. He stepped forward to hug her tightly, whispering, "You've changed the world, Mom." Margaret shook her head gently. "Not alone, I didn't. It took all of us working together. That's the lesson I want everyone to remember. None of us are powerless, not really. When we stand together, we can overcome anything." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the garden, Margaret reflected on how far she'd come. From the lonely nights spent worrying in her jail cell to the joyous camaraderie of this celebration, her journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had faced unimaginable challenges, yes, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and surrounded by people who cared deeply about making the world a better place. That night, as Margaret sat on her porch watching fireflies dance in the cool evening air, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Life hadn't returned to the way it was before the scandal. In many ways, it was better. She had discovered a deeper purpose, forged unbreakable bonds with her son and community, and proven to herself that even in the face of despair, hope could prevail. For Margaret Hensley, the future wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace, one bright bloom at a time.